There are moments so small that no one even notices, yet they hold the power to change the entire trajectory of a life. Chicago, October 12th, 1967. Backstage of a local theater, choked with sound and light. I still clearly remember the feeling that crept into my heart when the backstage door closed behind us. The air was thick with the scent of old wood, velvet, and the light spilling from the stage gap like thin blades cutting through the darkness. The whole theater that day seemed to be breathing, pulsating, waiting for our appearance. Michael, only 9 years old, stood right beside me. He was smaller than the lights hanging overhead, smaller than the chaotic noise echoing from the auditorium, yet somehow he made me feel the pressure as if I were protecting something so fragile that a single gust of wind could make it falter. I, Jackie, was the only one who saw that truth. The audience out there only knew a young genius. But me, I saw a younger brother trying to keep his composure with a strangely long breath, his hands clasped together in the dark, before involuntarily relaxing them to maintain the characteristic confident demeanor we always had to wear on stage. The velvet curtain in front was thick and heavy, but the sound of the audience pierced through it as clearly as if it were right next to my ear. I could hear the murmurs of anticipation, the tapping of someone's shoe on the floor due to impatience. But the sound I heard most clearly was Michael's heart, one beat of tightening, one beat of trembling, and then one beat of sheer determination. "I'm fine," Michael whispered, as if reminding himself. I turned to look at him. The corner of his mouth curved into a small smile, but his eyes held something more complex, a tension between courage and fear, between responsibility and the childhood he should still be living. I couldn't voice these things, couldn't break the strong facade we were forced to maintain before a show, but I saw it. Suddenly a light from a small gap in the velvet curtain shone directly onto Michael's shoes. It was then I realized the stage floor had been polished too intensely. It was so glossy, it reflected the light in a path as clear as thin ice. A chilling premonition flashed across me, but before I could grasp it, the manager yelled, "Positions!" We moved to our waiting spots. The sound now was heavy, like a heart about to burst. I could hear the slight rattle of the machinery raising the curtain, each small sound drawing along an invisible thread of anxiety. Michael stood half a step in front of me. He was so small, I could have placed my hand on his shoulder for reassurance, but I didn't, partly because I didn't want to make him more tense, partly because I myself was wound up like a spring. I clearly saw his small silhouette in the faint backstage light, his dark hair, his stance slightly tilted as if he were trying to shift his weight down into his shoes, a purely instinctual effort to control everything within his reach. "Jackie?" Michael called softly. I replied with a, "Yeah?" that I hoped was strong enough to erase the sense of suppression gripping us both. But Michael just smiled, a peculiar smile. It contained both nervousness and a spirit to overcome. He said nothing more, no questions, no worries, just looked straight ahead at the red curtain slowly drawing open. The moment the stage lights flooded in, I felt like I was being pushed out of a narrow tunnel. The cheers rushed toward us, powerful, obliterating all other sounds. But strangely, it was that noise that made the worries I was trying to conceal even more pronounced. Michael stepped forward half a beat before me, as usual. But the steps today were different. I noticed it immediately. It was a very small shift. His ankle tilted slightly, his knee a bit more tense than usual to maintain balance. No one but me realized it. The stage floor was dangerously slick. I took a deep breath. Once, then again. But the feeling wouldn't disappear. It clung to me like an invisible shadow, whispering that the smallest deviation in that would be enough to make everything slip through our fingers. The music began. The first notes sounded like they were beating directly against my chest. Michael moved forward another step, heading toward the central spotlight. His shoulders were relaxed, adopting the performance posture we had practiced, but his steps, despite his efforts to hide it, still slightly hesitated. Only I saw that. Only I knew how perilous it was. But this performance and the immense responsibility placed upon a 9-year-old boy did not allow anyone to stop to adjust or warn. No one was allowed to err, not for a single beat. The lights shone on Michael, encompassing him as the sole bright spot on the stage. The audience cheered when the first note of his singing rang out, and I could only stand right next to him, feeling all my senses stretched taut, as if I could hear the squeak of the slick floor beneath his feet. A performance that seemed impeccable, but I knew, deep in my gut, the storm was about to begin. Only a few seconds into the music, I felt something was off kilter. Not from the audience, not from the lights, but from Michael. His every movement, usually as fluid as water, carried a subtle layer of vigilance. It was as if his body was listening to the floor more than the melody. I stood half a step behind him, exactly in the position we always practiced, but this time every one of my senses was focused on those small feet. The slips were very slight, almost invisible to anyone else. But to me, who had performed beside him hundreds of times, it was as distinct as metal scraping stone. I tried to stay calm, but my inner self began to spiral into a strange feeling. Dread. Something I had never let show, especially in front of Michael. The audience continued to cheer, each sound seemingly pushing the stage toward its breaking point. The intense heat from the overhead lights made the air even more suffocating. And right at that moment, I witnessed the beginning of the nightmare we never thought would happen. Michael moved to the center of the stage, preparing to execute the simple spin he always did. But the second his foot landed on the precise spot that was over-polished, I sensed the trouble before my eyes registered it. A small movement, very small, a slip that was almost silent. But I heard it, I felt it, I saw his leg muscles tense, desperately trying to maintain balance, as the pull from the slick floor made his center of gravity tilt forward. Everything happened in an instant, yet it felt like an eternity to me, as if every second was stretched to the point of breaking. The stage suddenly became much quieter in my perception, even though the music was still blaring. I saw Michael's eyes widen, not in panic, but with an astonishing clarity for a 9-year-old. He didn't scream, didn't freeze completely. He simply fought his own momentum that was threatening to throw him down. I wanted to reach out and catch him. I wanted to step forward, half a pace to pull him back. But my feet felt bound by the unspoken rule of the stage. Do not break the rhythm. Do not reveal the mistake. Do not ruin the performance. I was trapped between the instinct to protect and the responsibility to perform, a predicament that made my chest constrict. Michael leaned a little further, his arms instinctively flaring out to balance. The light shone on his small frame, making the wobble more apparent, as if the entire stage was tilting with him. The audience was oblivious. They thought it was just a spontaneous move, a moment of soul from a genius boy, but I knew that if the slip had been a fraction stronger, if his ankle had weakened just slightly, if no one could save him in time, Michael would fall, right in the spotlight, right in front of hundreds of people, and I would never forgive myself. Just as I thought everything was about to end, Michael's eyes glanced at me. Only a brief moment, but enough for me to understand that. He knew, he sensed the danger, and he also sensed my fear. That gaze, strangely, was not afraid, but fierce, steely, as if he wanted to say, I won't let it defeat me. The slip became more pronounced. Michael was almost losing his footing. I swallowed hard, my heart hammering as if to burst out of my ribcage. I took half a step forward, pure instinct, controlling me, not reason. But before my hand could reach his shoulder, the unforeseen happened. Michael spun. A sudden spin, completely contrary to his initial move. He used the very momentum that was dragging him down to transform it into rotational force. His coat flared in an arc under the light. His hair swung out along the trajectory of the movement like a streak of dazzling artwork. The audience let out a collective gasp, a gasp of excitement, completely unaware that they had just witnessed a 9-year-old boy escape doom in a hair-thin moment. I stood petrified, not because the spin was so flawless it looked like a choreographed move, but because I knew the terrifying truth. He had just avoided a serious fall using only a God-given instinct, and I, even standing just a few feet away, was utterly powerless. Michael landed from the spin in a pose that even our choreographer hadn't conceived. He maintained his center of gravity, stood tall, and flashed a radiant smile as if everything was part of the plan. But I knew that behind that smile was a powerful undertow we had never faced. The audience roared with applause. I felt my heart still racing. As if it hadn't caught up with what had just happened, I looked at Michael. He looked back at me. No words were exchanged, but his eyes then, a look that only I understood, signaled that this was only the beginning. The real storm was silently brewing behind the lights. The stage in that moment became distorted like a stretched film frame. Every sound around me, the music, the audience, the footsteps, sank as if submerged underwater. The only thing that remained clear was the image of Michael standing in the spotlight, having just narrowly escaped a slip that I believe even an adult would have struggled to recover from. But what gave me the chills was not the slip, it was the silence that followed, a silence only I could hear. Michael stood motionless for a beat, just one beat, but in that brief second I saw his body subtly tremble, whether from adrenaline or from the realization of what he had just faced. The 9-year-old boy had turned the situation around masterfully, but the instant his feet touched the ground after the spin, I knew he felt the fragility of the line between performance and accident. Michael's eyes darted down at the floor for a split second, as if trying to understand what had just attempted to defeat him. Then he looked up, toward the lights. Not a moment of hesitation, not a single expression of fear for the audience to detect, but I, standing right next to him, perceived everything. At that point, I thought the performance would continue as usual. I thought Michael would adjust his movements, sticking to the safe rhythm we had practiced. But what happened next upended my entire perception, a plot twist that still sends shivers down my spine whenever I recall it. Michael stepped forward, one step very slow, very calculated, as if he were challenging the very floor that had betrayed him. Michael, don't take any more risks, I thought, but couldn't speak, couldn't break the rhythm, couldn't approach him, couldn't let the audience suspect. The boy, barely half the height of the stage wings, maintained an unbelievable composure. He didn't retreat, didn't shrink back, but advanced in a way that was utterly defiant. Then the unforeseen happened. Michael, as if following an invisible call, spun for the second time, not a forced spin to save himself like the first time, but a wholly deliberate spin, confident, precise, and so magnificent it took my breath away. The lights shone on him, creating a ring of light like the outline of a cinematic character stepping out of the shadows. His reflexes were no longer a child's reflexes, they were those of a true artist. The audience erupted in cheers, as if they were witnessing a historical moment. I felt my legs turn to jelly, not from fear, but from sheer astonishment. How could a 9-year-old boy transform peril into such a dazzling moment? He spun one more time, not a big one, but enough to completely mask any trace of the near accident. And then he ended in a pose no one would have thought was spontaneous. One foot lightly extended forward, hand touching precisely the position that formed a perfect silhouette under the light. An iconic moment, a moment that everyone in that theater that day believed was meticulously choreographed, a moment that years later people would still recall as a pure example of the ability to turn danger into art. I stood there, as if nailed to the floor. My breathing was uneven. My heart was still racing from the near fall earlier, but Michael, that boy, had crossed a boundary I was not ready to cross, the boundary of self-assurance, far exceeding his age, of the ability to command the stage with a presence too great for his small frame. I looked into his eyes. This time his gaze was completely different. Not the bewildered look from the near fall, not the look seeking my protection, but the look of someone who had just discovered something new, formidable, and powerful within himself. A look that seemed to ask, if I can turn a fall into that, what else am I capable of? That was no longer a child's question. It was the question of an artist in the making. The music continued. The audience had no idea what had just transpired behind the light and applause, but I knew, very clearly, that moment, the recovery from the near fall becoming the highlight, would be the thing that followed Michael throughout his performing career. And I, standing just a few feet away from him, felt I had just witnessed something that stage history rarely gets to see, the formation of an icon, right before my eyes, out of danger, from a slip that seemed entirely accidental. When the lights changed color, preparing for the next segment of the song, I knew that night had crossed into a completely different territory, a territory that even I could no longer grasp, because Michael, that small boy, had begun to write his own legend with a moment of near disaster. I could still hear the audience's applause, even though it was cut off by the backstage door as soon as we entered. The noise suddenly became strangely piercing, as if it belonged to another world, a world where everything was bright, perfect, and no one knew about the near-catastrophic slips or the fear compressed behind the lights. Michael walked in a few seconds after me. As soon as the door closed, he immediately bent down, hands on his knees, taking a long, shuddering breath I had never heard during a performance before. It wasn't a breath of fatigue, not a breath from dancing too hard. It was the breath of someone who had just escaped an abyss. The pale yellow backstage light shone on his face, clearly showing the tension in his facial muscles. Not fear, not entirely, but a peculiar mix of shock, relief, and something deeper, something even he didn't fully comprehend yet. I approached, intending to put my hand on his shoulder, but stopped halfway. Not because I was afraid he would break down, but because I was afraid of touching the very moment he was most emotionally exposed and shattering it. Michael looked up at me. In those eyes I saw conflict. One part of him was still the little boy needing his big brother's protection, but another part had crossed the thin line between child and artist. I almost fell, Michael said in a low voice, as if not wanting anyone else to hear, though only we and a few backstage shadows were present. I nodded slightly. I know. He swallowed hard, his throat moving with an unusual effort. I felt the slip. The instant my foot hit that spot, I thought I was lost. I remained silent because if I had opened my mouth, I would have said something an artist should never hear right after leaving the stage. Yes, you almost were lost, but I couldn't let him hear that. Not today, not when his mind was so fragile. Instead, I asked a different question. But why did you spin? I thought you'd hold it or step back. Michael looked down at his shoes. The shoes that were once his closest friend on stage now seemed like the culprits who had tried to harm him. I don't know, Michael said slowly, word by word. But the moment I felt myself losing balance, the first thing I thought of was the audience. They couldn't see me fall. Not tonight. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine with every word he spoke, a 9-year-old child, thinking of the audience before himself. Then Michael continued, his voice trembling slightly. Then my body just spun. It was like it knew what to do all by itself. I was stunned. That statement, a simple statement, touched upon the secret fear I always tried to avoid. His body just spun. He didn't consciously choose it. He wasn't in control. A reflex that was too perfect, too instinctual, too brilliant. And sometimes, things that are too perfect instill more fear in the witness than admiration. I watched Michael for a long time. He was sitting on a wobbly wooden chair backstage, his back slightly hunched, his hands clasped, as if trying to decipher his own self. In that moment, I realized one thing. Not only was the audience mesmerized by that spin, not only was I left dumbfounded by it, but even Michael didn't fully comprehend the power that had just erupted from within him. A slow minute of silence passed, and then Michael lifted his head, his eyes no longer shaking. "Jackie," he called me, his voice firmer this time. "Did you see how they reacted when I spun?" I nodded. They thought it was a new dance move. Michael pressed his lips together, as if holding something back. "I heard them scream. They liked it." A smile flashed across his face. Not big, not self-satisfied, but the smile of someone trying to understand a secret that had just been revealed. "I've never heard them cheer like that," Michael said softly. I moved closer, sitting down in front of him. "Do you know why?" He shook his head. "Because you just turned something terrifying into a moment that touched them. You didn't let the mistake defeat you. You turned it into art." Michael was silent. I could see his heart beating very fast beneath his clothes. The emotions inside him were swirling like the vortex on stage, beautiful, dangerous, unpredictable. Then he asked the question that chilled me more than anything else. "Jackie, if I hadn't spun in time, though, things would be different, right?" I couldn't speak for a few seconds. I knew I had to answer in a way that wouldn't hurt him, but also wouldn't lie to him. "Yes, it would be different," I spoke very softly. "But you did spin, you saved yourself, and you made it the most memorable moment of the night." Michael leaned back in the chair, his eyes looking up at the ceiling. I didn't know what he was thinking, but I clearly saw one thing. That slip had become a critical piece in his mind, a piece that would follow him for a very long time, maybe for the rest of his life. And I, the brother who witnessed the moment, sensed what the audience didn't know, what the lights didn't illuminate, and what Michael hadn't yet realized. Tonight, something within him had awakened. Not just stage instinct, not just reflex, but the thing that would later make him known by 2 words: icon. The light from the stage still spilled through the backstage door gap like a thin blade, slicing in two the world we stood in. On one side was the ostentatious light, the excited cheers, the faces unaware of what had almost happened. On the other was the small, quiet room, where the truth was heavier than the blaring music and more dangerous than any light. Michael sat there, leaning slightly forward, his hands clasped as if holding something fragile in his lap. But I knew that fragile thing wasn't his body, but his psyche. That slip didn't just test his feet, it tested his heart. "Jackie?" Michael called me again, his voice so soft I had to lean down to hear clearly. "Do the best artists all go through things like that, those moments where they think they're going to fail?" That question, coming from a 9-year-old, made me feel like everything around me paused. I sat down in front of him, low enough to look directly into the eyes, waiting for an answer. I couldn't lie, but I couldn't tell the whole truth either. Not now. "The best artists," I said slowly, are not the ones who never slip, but the ones who know what to do when it happens. Michael listened silently, every word soaking into the emotional vortex still spinning within him. And tonight, I paused for a beat. You proved it. Michael took a deep, deep breath, as if trying to control his heart. Then he sat up straight, his eyes no longer hiding the transformation, as if a spark had just ignited from the deepest part of him. When I spun, Michael said, his gaze becoming distant, I saw everything moving, but at the same time it was very clear. Like, I knew what to do, but I don't know why I was able to do it. I shuddered. That statement not only contained the truth of the moment on stage, but also the promise of the future. I wanted to tell him that great artists sometimes don't choose their iconic moments, but that moment, chooses them. But I remained silent. He was too young to hear that. The audience liked it, Michael continued, his voice still faintly trembling. When they cheered, I felt stronger. I looked at him for a long time. In his eyes, I no longer saw just my little brother. I saw someone standing on the threshold of becoming something bigger than himself. But accompanying that light was a shadow, an invisible pressure that I knew would only grow, a weight that even grown men would struggle to bear. I stood up, gently placing my hand on his shoulder. No more hesitation. Michael, I said, my voice low. Tonight, you just went through something many artists never face in their entire lives. You didn't just overcome it. You turned it into something extraordinary. He looked up, the backstage light reflecting in his eyes, making his pupils seem deeper. You think that's a moment to be proud of? I smiled. Not just proud. That's a moment that one day people will call iconic. Michael froze. He seemed not to fully grasp the meaning of the word, or he understood, but didn't yet believe it could apply to himself. He braced his hands on the chair, slowly standing up. His small legs, the legs that had just battled the treacherous floor, wobbled for a beat, but then stood firm immediately. I saw the new resolve forming in him. Not the resolve of a boy who wants to perform for fun, but of someone realizing they can create something monumental. Then he said a sentence that I will always remember. Jackie, if I can turn a slip into a beautiful moment, then I want to see what else I can do. I understood right then. That moment of peril didn't weaken him. It made him stronger. It made him curious about himself in a way no one could stop. And then, like an invisible cue, the backstage crew pushed the door open, urging us back to the stage for the rest of the show. Michael stood beside me, his shoulders small yet straight, the outside stage light once again drawing a thin line of brightness on his body. He didn't look back at the floor, didn't look at his shoes. He only looked toward the door opening to the noisy world, where he had almost been defeated just minutes before. I suddenly realized the slip didn't choose Michael. Michael chose how to rise from it. And as he stepped back into that brilliant light again, I knew tonight was not just a performance. It was the genesis of a legend that began with a moment whose depth only he and I truly understood. That slip didn't break him, it created him. And so, amidst the cheers about to erupt as we returned to the stage, I followed him, simultaneously proud, fearful, and utterly certain of one thing. The world was about to witness what I had just seen, the emergence of an icon,